unmute yourself. Can you unmute? Oh, there you go.
I believe we're ready to start. Our technical helper, can you tell us if that's all right for us to begin? Maybe we can ask a participant to write us a note in the chat room if they can hear us and see us, and we can begin.
It looks like they can, so why don't we go ahead and start?
Okay, let's go ahead. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joanne Lesage Nelson, the moderator for this afternoon's program, Promoting Your Efforts in the Media. I'm very pleased to be joining Deanna Fox, who will be giving you the meat of this presentation and sharing all her wisdom. Deanna is a freelance food and agricultural journalist who travels the globe in search of the story, meaning, and purpose of our food heritage and our food systems. She focuses specifically on food history, the business of agriculture, profiles and trend reporting, home cooking, and the socio-political implications of food. My role today will be to help facilitate questions and move things along. So let's get started, Deanna.
Thanks so much, Joanne. So thank you everybody for joining today. My name is Deanna Fox. And most people in the Capital Region, if you're tuning in from the Albany area, know me from the Times Union, the Daily Gazette, and WAMC. But I write for publications all over the country and all over the world and do a lot of in-depth reporting on food insecurity, for one. So, in my experience working as a freelance journalist, I get a ton of press releases every day, a ton of media inquiries every day, probably anywhere from 20 to 30 a day, I would say. And it's really hard to get through all of those press releases every day and all of those emails and really get to what the heart of the story is and what's really trying to be promoted. Um, I'm not alone in that. I think that most editors and writers have that experience, and it becomes very difficult to really sluice through all of the the information to try to get to a really great story that offers a lot of information for our readership or our viewership or listenership. So I thought that we could talk today about kind of best practices and how to approach the media, because it used to be just you would get those contacts into your email inbox, or maybe you would get a phone call. But more and more, it's become a situation where we're also getting social media contacts, Twitter direct messages, and Instagram messages, or just being tagged in things, and we miss a lot of things, a lot of really great stories. And also, um, you know, it's a very stressful job, as most of your jobs probably are, and time is of the essence when you're trying to crank out an edition every day. So I thought we could go through some best practices, and maybe that would help you. And I really encourage you to leave comments, leave questions in the comment box, and Joanne and I will try to get to those as best we can. Joanne's also a PR practitioner, and she's great at it. So she probably has a lot of information that she can share as well. So I have a presentation I'm going to try to share. Let's see here. Let's see what we can do here. All right. So hopefully that's on your screen. Joanne, can you see that okay?
I cannot.
Oh, no. Okay. Let's try again. Hang on one second. I'm so sorry. Let's see. Hang on. Okay. One more time. How about now?
No,
Still good? Still good.
sorry.
Okay.
It may be because, there we go.
Do we have it? Oh,
We have part of it. I think you need to
okay.
enlarge it or maximize it.
One more time.
There we go. Beautiful.
There we go. That's it. Perfect. All right. This is a new platform for a lot of us. So we're still working on it. So, anyway, how to communicate with the media to further your mission. And this is really applicable to journalists and editors, whether it's a newspaper, a TV station, a radio station. It's all kind of the same idea. So the first slide here is finding the story. So what actually is the story? Is it a profile, a trends report, a news piece, or event announcement? And who does it apply to? So when you're putting together your kind of plan of attack for how to promote your story, you have to think about uh, kind of where it fits within the general news cycle. So if it's just an event that you're hosting or a press conference and you want to put out a media advisory, um, we'll talk about that in a future slide. But is it just something that you want to alert the media to, or do you want an in-depth kind of story? Is there a really interesting trend that you see happening that might apply to a certain journalist within your market? Um, and then who does it apply to? So who's the audience that you want to speak to? Are you looking to contact readers or viewers or listeners who could potentially volunteer for your organization or they could donate? Is there something that's happening in the political sphere that you want to alert um, the readership to the subscribers to? So you really have to think about the what the actual story is and who it applies to. And when you can answer those two things, it makes it much easier to kind of figure out what journalists you need to be contacting.
And I think another consideration you might want to give, very much along with what Deanna said, is what's your objective? If it's an event, do you want people to show up, the general public, or do you just want the media to cover it? If it's a policy issue, are you looking to affect some change in policy? So consider what's your objective in getting the media attention.
Absolutely. So the next kind of idea here is to mine the data. So the more work that you're able to do for the journalists that you're approaching, the more likely you are to get your story published. So when you send out that initial pitch email or phone call or however you might do it, I think email is probably the best way. Um, Go through and find links to reports that might apply to the story or for background information on people who might be involved in the story. If there's another story in a different publication that has kind of the same angle that you're approaching, include a link in your email to that story. Um, if the publication that you're approaching has written about the story or that journalist has written about your organization in the past, just put a link in just to remind them, that you have that connection there. Do you have any reports that your organization has created? Sometimes just sending an email with your latest report is helpful in that we have that information, but it can be difficult for us to find the time to read through the whole thing and create a timely story related to it. So when you have that report, make sure in your pitch email that you're including information about why that report is applicable to the news cycle, and why it's relevant to the reader. And just in that vein, if you have any of your own statistics to support your pitch, that's very helpful as well. If you can say, last month we gave out X amount of boxes, we worked with we serviced X amount of clients, or we had X amount of volunteers. That information is very, very helpful and makes the story come together much better. All right. So who are the players in your story here? So who are the people applicable to your story? Who within your organization is critical in conveying the message? So, the easiest person to go to for a journalist is just the executive director, because they're the person who's kind of the stopgap for all of the information. They're going to be the person that can speak authoritatively on the topic. But if there's somebody else within your organization who is a really great person to convey what's happening within your organization, that's great. It could be a person who's in charge of volunteer services. It could be a person who is your media person if you have one. Um, but it's important to know who the best person is to tell your story and connect them to the journalist. The same to be said, who can be made for available for interview and comment. Um, if the executive director is not available, or if there's more people in the organization who can help, those are always great to include their name, their title, their contact information, and preferably two forms of contact. So an email and a phone number if possible. So we can reach them directly and quickly. And then what are the other sources at play here? Are there government officials that would be a good person to contact for the story? Do you have partners in the business community locally who would be great to include in this story? Providing their names and their contact information is also really, really helpful. It cuts down the amount of time that we have to spend digging for that information, and it makes it more likely. The more that's done for us, the more likely we are to turn that story around very quickly and cover um, your organization and the stories at hand. And it also allows you to guide the conversation a little bit more. If you're giving us a lot of information about who we should be contacting, it allows you to have a little bit more control over the angle of the story.
A couple other groups, Deanna, I'd like to hear your impression on this, because this is something that I practice, every day. One is something we call third-party endorsers. That might be a university professor who has a specialty in the area that you're discussing, or you want the media to pay attention to. Someone who can, is outside of your organization, much like government officials or business partners, who can add a voice to the story and add some credibility. Is that something you look for, Deanna?
Yeah.
When you
Absolutely. So
Great.
it's always great. You never want as a journalist, you never want your story to read like a regurgitated press release.
Right.
It's unethical, in my opinion, and it's just sloppy journalism.
Sure.
But time constraints,
Laziness.
yeah, time constraints make it really difficult to create a lot of really in depth and rich and nuanced stories that really help communicate the issue at hand to the reader and help them gauge some level of context and understanding. So if there is somebody in the community who, um, like you said, Joanne, like a college professor or somebody working in another organization within the community that could give more background and more information and more context to the story, we always want to include those people. It's very helpful, and it keeps us from a lot of times when I need somebody who's in like academia for a story. It takes me several hours to find that person. So maybe the story doesn't make it to this week's paper or tomorrow's paper. It might take a couple of weeks just because it takes so much time for me to find the right contact. So if your organization already has that contact in your pocket, definitely pass it along. Very helpful.
And the last group is, and every organization calls them something different, whether it's clients or consumers or users. And I know sometimes it's difficult, especially, with an issue like food insecurity. But if you can identify someone who's a user of your services, or in healthcare, someone who's a patient, or in a social services program, someone who's a consumer of some of their programs. Sometimes it's difficult because of confidentiality issues and pride issues, but I know reporters always ask me, can I talk to an end user? Can I talk to someone who benefits from these services or these programs? It might take some digging on your part, but almost always we're able to work with our clients to find someone who will speak.
Right. And I always ask that question whenever it's really great to add a human element to something that
Right.
feels kind of removed and cold. So if I have the opportunity to speak to somebody who's utilizing the service, that just adds a lot of nuance
Right.
and just compassion and humanity to the story, which I think is really important. Those are the stories that get a lot of resonance outside of just being posted to a website or into a paper or on TV or whatever. Those are the stories that get shared on social media. Those are the stories that get a lot of play outside of the news organization. So, which is great. It gives you some content to use. It gives the organization some content to use for um, just for your own kind of PR maneuvers, I guess, and marketing maneuvers. So finding the right contacts. So are you talking to the right reporter? That's a really great question. Maybe the business editor isn't the right editor that you should be sending this information to. And for the most part, journalists, editors are really great at sharing information with each other and passing things along to a different section. But it's really important to know who the people are at the news organization, which can be tough because things um, people leave, come and go. It's a very fluid community in journalism. But the best way to kind of do that is to follow people on Twitter. So if you have somebody who can work in marketing, or you have um, intern who can handle some social media for you, have them track and even keep a separate list on Twitter um, of or on Instagram of journalists in the area who are um, helpful or influential to your organization. And that's probably the best way to find out if that's still the right person you should be talking to. Um, which is the best news source or format to tell your story? Is this something that has a lot of visual content? If it is, then maybe that's something that would be best for a TV station, a news station. If it's something where there's a lot of data that needs to be shared, or it's a human interest story, that might be a newspaper piece. If it's something where there's a lot of interesting sound, like maybe you're going out into the community to hand out backpacks of food, or maybe you are working with school children to establish a new garden, something with a lot of really interesting sound, that might be something best for radio. um, and then another question is this something best suited for your social media? Maybe it's not newsworthy. Maybe it's newsworthy to the people who are already paying attention to what you're doing, but it might not be the best way for you to garner media attention for your organization. Um, some differentials between if you should use it on your own social media content or if it should be something you approach a journalist about would be the depth of the story. So if it's something quick, just you're handing out backpacks that week, or you're handing out meal boxes, food boxes that week. That might be something that's just best to broadcast in your own marketing. So your own social media, your own newsletters, that sort of information. If it's something on a bigger scale, you're distributing boxes, but the boxes also include $50 gift card, or they that was donated by a certain business, or it was part of a government grant, something like that. Or it's was the boxes were created in partnership with a local CSA program. That's more newsworthy. That's something where we could tell a more in-depth story, and so that might be something that you want to reach out to a journalist about. And then maintaining those contacts is really important. I think I talk about that on the next slide. Yes. So offering an exclusive. Um, it's really important to maintain relationships with the journalists that you do work with. You can offer them an exclusive. You can make it clear, and you can put a certain timeline on that. Like it's an exclusive for you for 24 hours. If you can, or a week, or however long your window is. If you can secure a spot in the media for us, then we won't talk to anybody else. The story will just be for you. That's always helpful and induces a journalist to move a little more quickly. Make sure you put that in like bold letters. You can put it right at the top of your email if you think that's helpful. It usually is helpful. I really appreciate that because I'm a freelancer and I work for a plethora of news sources. So I can reach out to, if I get a no from one place, I'll get a yes somewhere else. So it's nice to know that I'm not doubling over efforts of someone else who's already working within those newsrooms. So it's helpful for me and people in my position, I think. But you can also maintain those relationships outside of just pitching. You can reach out to journalists and invite them to come in and do a tour of your facility, just one-on-one, and allow them to ask questions that they might have. You can set up a volunteer or opportunity for a journalist so they get in-depth hands-on knowledge of what it is that you're actually doing. So think outside the box. Don't just think about maintaining the relationship through pitching. Think about ways that you can really develop a bond almost with that journalist. And if you're able to do that, your organization becomes the first one that they think of when they have a story. If something gets thrown in their lap and they need somebody at a food security organization that can give them some quotes, they're going to think of you first. Other goals. So be very specific in your goals. Make it very clear what you want from the journalist. Make it very clear that you'd like a story, or you'd like somebody to come for a press event, a press conference. Offer them some ideas, like, tell them maybe this is a story. We have these to come up with some scenario. We have these families who are utilizing the service, and we want to tell the story about how our service is really helping their lives. Would you be interested in doing a series on these families? That's something very specific that will kind of get our brains moving, thinking about how we can turn this into a story. Be very unique. Look for a story that no one else can offer. So you really have to think about what makes your organization different than anyone else around you. It could be somebody that's working for you that has a really interesting backstory. It could be one of your consumers or clients that has a really compelling story that you might want to share, and you can weave it into how your organization has helped them. And then again, just know what's a story, what's a news item, and what's a media advisory. So the difference in those things is a media advisory is just kind of a quick bullet point email that has the who, what, when, where of an event, a media event. And that's really just to get a photographer, a videographer, a radio producer there to kind of capture images and get some details that they bring back to the newsroom that a reporter can write up. A news item is similar to that, but maybe you don't actually have an event where there can be pictures or video taken. So maybe it's just an announcement of a new community partner that you're working with. And maybe you just send that to an editor, a city desk editor or somebody like that, who can just put it in a quick, small part of the paper. And then a story is something that's more in depth. It's several hundred, if not 1,000 or 2,000 words long. It has photos, and it's something that takes a little bit more time. It creates, a lot of nuance, a lot of interest for the reader, and it just generally allows people to know more about your organization without it sounding like a press release was printed in the paper. So that's kind of the gist of it. This is my contact information if you want it, if you're looking for a journalist to engage with. If you have more questions that come to you after this event and you want to email them, you can always reach me at that email address. And the handle there is for Instagram and Twitter. And then that's it. So we can stop.
Yeah, can I just add one thing related to that last slide you talked about regarding relationship building and pitching? We all like to hear positive feedback. So if somebody spends a good deal of time with you and does a profile on the consumer or your organization and takes some time, it doesn't hurt to just send a quick note after and said, thanks for the time you spent with us. We really appreciate it. I think you did a great job on the story. It's not often that any of us hear positive feedback like that. It's usually just a complaint. So I try and make it a habit to, thank people for spending the time and for really doing a nice job. That helps build relationships because, as Deanna said, if you're someone who, is top of mind or who is responsive and can get a resource for a reporter easily or quickly, that's someone who's going to be valued to the reporter as a good contact to have, someone that he or she will go back to.
Absolutely. And on the same note as feedback, positive feedback is always very welcome. But I think most journalists, especially, I know this is true for me, if we get a detail wrong, if there's something that we didn't quite hit the mark on in our reporting, also follow up to let us know that. Do it as kindly as you can, hopefully. But it's really important for us to know that we're being fair and accurate in our reporting. So if we say something, we write something that isn't as accurate as you think it could be, definitely reach out and share that information too.
And I would say reach out to the individual, not to his or her editor.
Yeah,
Don't skip over the person and go to his or her boss, because that's certainly not a good way to handle any kind of situation.
right. And generally we're going to try to we will let our editor know that we made that mistake, and we'll do what we can. If you don't hear any feedback from the journalists, then give it a couple of days, and then follow up, because we're all just buried in email. But if you don't hear back from that journalist within a week, then definitely reach out to the editor. But start first with the actual journalist.
Right. As you can see on the screen, you have the ability to ask questions in the chat room. And while you're thinking of those questions, let me start by posing a few to Deanna for her to respond to. When should an organization or an individual reach out to a journalist directly rather than sending a mass email? And when is a mass email pitch or whatever appropriate?
Mass email. So basically, you're putting your listserv or your email list in a BBC field in your email. Is great for media advisories. It's great for quick, short news items that really aren't an in-depth story that you're trying to tell. Reaching out to an individual journalist, you always do better if you reach them directly with a lot of the tips that we shared in that slide. And make it very personal. We can read pretty quickly when you're just copying and pasting into an email what you've sent to a lot of other um, reporters. So make it personal. Go back to that idea of including links that either that journalist has covered before, um, or that the paper that they write, the news source that they work for has published before, so that they know, the journalist knows, that you've done your research too. It's not just on us, that you're also kind of a partner in telling the story. And it's really, there's a lot of competition in the field of journalism, and if a lot of journalists all within the same organization, the same publication, are getting the same pitch, the same email, is going to create some strife within the organization too. And it's going to run into complications for you, because you're going to get multiple inquiries and emails and phone calls back that will duplicate efforts for you as well. So it just makes it better for everyone if you have a really rich and nuanced story that you want to tell, to start with one person specifically, and then just work down your list.
Correct. I wholeheartedly agree on that. What are some ways for people to build relationships with the media outside of just sending them a news release or whatever?
Yeah. So just making the first step should always just be like reaching out. If you're new to the organization, or there's a new journalist that's kind of covering the beat that involves you, reach out to them. Just send an email, tell them who you are, kind of what you do within the organization, or what your organization does, and the ways that they can reach you, and just let them know kind of when you're available to offer comments, or to talk about stories. That's always really helpful. Just getting that first introductory email. Following those people on social media, so Twitter and Instagram specifically, is always very helpful. Going going through kind of your list of opportunities that you have coming up. So if you have a volunteer opportunity, or you have time to give a tour of your facility, reach out to a journalist and invite them to those events. And then also just, offering, to meet for a cup of coffee sometime once it's safe for all of us to be out in the world again, is always very helpful. So just, don't always approach a journalist with a clear, specific
Right.
goal in mind or mission in mind. Sometimes just reaching out to let them know who you are is very helpful and helps to keep things top of mind.
And I've reached out to reporters who are new to the area as well. Now, I think the Times Union has recently hired 3 or 4 brand new reporters who aren't from the capital region. So they're coming from either other states or other parts of the state. And I've reached out to them just to say, hey, can we meet for a cup of coffee? I'm not looking for you to write a story. I just want you to know about a particular client, or in our participants' cases here, a particular organization, so you'll be aware of this organization, because the time might come when you need someone in that industry or that field and you'd like to talk to. We want you to know about us, and we want you to know that we're available. And I think that's helpful to especially new reporters in the area, so they can get familiar with what's available and who might be a good resource for them.
Right. If you're working in the food security sector, the food journalist or even lifestyle journalists within your market, those are great resources to have. But then also knowing if there's a specific editor that's or journalist who's dedicated to your city. Like maybe they just cover Schenectady, maybe they just cover Troy, maybe they just cover Syracuse. Really important to know those people as well. And those should be your primary contacts. And then you can kind of work more broadly from there and just go to a news director, a city desk editor, a managing editor, someone on that level. But the specifics are really important in journalism.
Great. What do you think are some things to avoid in media relations practices? What are your pet peeves?
Pet peeves are when your email is shared in a CC instead of a BCC. That's very frustrating. It's also frustrating because not so much that our email is being shared. My email address is all over the internet. But it's more frustrating to see that you want me to give attention to your story, but you're not willing to go through the detail of at least contacting me specifically outside of everyone else that you're contacting. I want to know that you think that I'm the right fit to tell your story, not necessarily that you're just trying to broadcast this to as many people as possible. That's fine when it's something small like a media advisory or a press release. That's okay. But for a very specific story that you want to tell, don't send it in a mass email to everybody at once. That's a big pet peeve. And then not being understanding of the way journalism works. We're not there to just be a mouthpiece of your story. We're there to be fair and accurate and tell the story as a whole as best as we can. We might ask questions that you don't like. We might reach out to people for detail about something that we can't quite understand, and we're not getting all the detail from your organization. So that just have a basic understanding of how journalism works is always great. And what's another pet peeve that I have? Only reaching me on social media is a big pet peeve. My email address, like I said, is all over the internet, as is most journalists. It's usually attached to their Instagram or Twitter handle. So find that information, follow them on, social media, but then be sure to actually remove yourself from that social media feed and go into their inbox and reach them directly in their email. If after a couple of days you don't hear from them via email, then you can send them a DM, but don't use a DM as your primary approach to reaching a journalist. An email goes a lot farther.
Before I ask the next question, I'm surprised to see no one has any questions. So if you don't have a question that you want to share.
I have a couple of questions I see.
Oh,
so
okay.
Yep, there's two.
Now I see them.
Okay.
Alrighty. Great. But let me ask just one question, or make a quick comment, because it follows up very nicely to what you just said. I think one of the pet peeves that I've experienced as a public relations professional working with journalists is when a client or someone asks, can I read the story before it's printed? And my answer to them is always absolutely not. That's not something, but I'm sure you've had experiences where someone has said that to you. Can I read the story before it's printed? What's your response to that?
Yeah, my response is also no. I'm not annoyed by that question because I think that that's your, if you have a PR practitioner that you're working with, or, just your executive director or whoever handles media relations, like, you want to know what's coming out before the story is told. So I'm not annoyed that you asked. My answer is always going to be no. But then I'll usually ask you if there's something that concerns you. Was there something in our conversation, or some element that you feel like I didn't understand, and you want to tell me about it? Or do you just want a general, like, once over? If there is a specific thing that you feel is concerning before you've even seen the piece, just from our conversations, that's something that any journalist should want to address and talk about. But no, I'm never going to let you read the story before it's published. And most of the time, I don't even read the story before it's published. Once it goes to an editor, there's very little I can do. And sometimes the piece that I wrote and handed in isn't the piece that actually appears. So that happens too. So I don't always have control over everything that happens once the piece is out of my hands.
So Deanna, somebody asked, how do you respectfully approach parents in particular to ask them to tell their child's story or their story, or allow their children to speak to you as a reporter?
That really just comes down. So I'm looking at the question along with you. I want to make sure I understand it. Yeah. I mean, if I'm asking from a journalist perspective, I'm going to ask someone in the organization to get approvals from the parents.
That's usually my job.
Yeah, right. To get approval from the parents so that I can talk to them. And then it's totally fine for the parent to be included in the conversation with the child. It's usually preferred. I know I have 2 children myself, and I know that they've been interviewed before. And sometimes they just have trouble, they have like family language that they use that doesn't always communicate to the outside world. So just being there to kind of help them communicate as best as they can is helpful. So it's never a problem for me when a kid is involved. There are some legal things regarding that. If I were just to go to a children's cafe or a food pantry that served children, a soup kitchen that served children, I can't necessarily take their photo or ask them questions in certain circumstances without legal permission from a guardian or parent. But from the organizational standpoint, a journalist should be very understanding if you need time to contact those parents and ask those questions. And just be very clear. As long as you're clear about the process and what's required of the process. If I were to ask, I'd really love to talk to a kid who's using your after school program. Could you facilitate that for me? It might take a day or two to hear back, and that's okay. Just let them know that let the journalists know that you have to contact the parents.
Great. Another individual asked if you could provide an example of a successful pitch that worked with you, and she said, can either of us? So, I certainly have examples of that, but I'd certainly rather hear from you what you think.
Go ahead, Joanne, you go first.
Well, I think I'll talk about something that I worked on with a human services organization that I represent. They have a very intense and extensive domestic violence program. They treat and shelter people with domestic violence issues. And you talked about, capitalizing on a trend or a national story or something. So oftentimes, if there is a story about domestic violence nationally, we will reach out to the media and say, we have a local expert who can talk to you. Now, we're in no way, shape, or form trying to capitalize on somebody else's difficulty or horrible situation. But typically, the media wants to localize a story and talk to a local expert who can provide context, who can provide, ways that a victim can seek help or provide education to young people to avoid domestic violence. So that's something that, you should pay attention to. If your organization sees a national story or a trend that you can localize for the media. And 9 times out of 10, we get responses from the media immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean within 10 or 15 minutes, and say, yes, we would like to speak to someone local who can help us with this story. So keep those trends and national or even statewide issues in mind if they're appropriate for your organization.
Absolutely, that's a great tip. And being able to stay on trend and on the precipice of urgency for the media is really important.
Right.
Things that are less urgent that have been successful. There was an organization a few years ago who reached out to me because they were shifting the way that they actually provided services. So instead of just giving, kind of you get what you get format, they moved to a choice-based, an option-based format where their consumers were actually allowed to choose what they wanted at the food pantry. And they were very specific on why that was important. And they were able to relay it into, think about if you were an immigrant into a new country. And you had no idea if you went into a grocery store and you had no idea what most of those foods were, but you saw a few things that were familiar and you knew you could cook them, and the rest wouldn't go to waste. That's kind of why it was important for them to make that shift. Kind of the same parallel of just being familiar with the product and knowing that the food wasn't going to go to waste. So that was like very specific and clear, and made this kind of news blip really human and have a lot of context. So that was important. I think there was an organization a few years ago who had like a surplus of I can't remember what it was. It might have been squash. They had like this big surplus of a certain potato or squash or something that came through, and they didn't really know how to deal with it. So they contacted me, but they put it in the context of being able to work with other pantries and organizations within the area to kind of barter and trade, within themselves, to make sure that everybody had what they needed. So they used their kind of unusual circumstance to benefit everybody. And that was really important. It was like a big bumper crop year for some reason. So those pitches were successful because they were very specific and they had very clear goals, and they weren't just like, we have a lot of squash right now and we'd like you to write about it, or we changed our program and we think you should write about it. They told me why I should write about it, and why it was important. And that was like, yep, okay, let's write about
Why
it.
it matters to other people.
Right.
Right.
Other people outside of the organization.
Right.
It didn't just matter to people who, are involved with the organization. It mattered to people, and kind of change their understanding of what a food pantry might do, and what some of the real, besides just a lack of funding or a lack of volunteers, what some of the real problems are, that can get people to kind of frame their understanding of what a food pantry does a little bit differently.
Great. How much advance notice should someone provide a journalist before, expecting them to show up at an event?
If it's like a press conference or an event, at least a week minimum. 10 days is great, week minimum. And then kind of in your social media or your media relations strategy, you send out the initial contact. Maybe you reach out to a few journalists in particular that you'd really like to be there. You think it could augment their coverage of the topic, or of their beat, and be specific about why you want them to be there, and what kind of story angles you think they could pull from that event. And then 3 days before, send a reminder. The day before, send a reminder, or if not the day before, the morning of. That's usually a good timeline.
And I would add to that, make follow-up calls that morning to say, are you going to be able to send somebody? This is why it's important. This is why your viewers or readers or listeners would, be interested in this, because they get hundreds of them a day.
Absolutely.
So the follow-up, it really can differentiate you from the rest of them in the pile.
Absolutely.
So somebody writes, I've had instances where what I hope to get across in an interview seems to get lost in translation once it gets aired. What suggestions or tips do you have to ensure what I want conveyed actually is conveyed?
When you send your pitch, when you reach out to a journalist, if that's the way that you garnered that attention, you can send like a bulleted list of kind of speaking points or important details, mining that data that we talked about in the early part of the presentation is really important. You can ask them, ask them throughout the interview, like, can I rephrase that for you? Does that make sense? Ask them if they need more detail about anything. Follow up with them, like Joanne said earlier, instead of just following up after the story is aired, follow up a few hours after or the next day of being interviewed, and just ask them if they have any clarifying questions. Or you can just send them an email or phone call, like, I want to make sure that this particular point really is concrete here. Here's what is really happening, or here's why this is important, and just reiterate your point. And sometimes, some people are verbal communicators, some people are written communicators, both in presenting and receiving. So, giving the information in a different format sometimes helps. But if it's after the fact, it's a little bit harder. So the more work you can do proactively before the piece actually makes it to publication, the better.
And I would say as a PR professional that preparation is really key. And one of the things you should really give some serious thought to before you pitch a story or send a release is, what are your key messages? What are the central things you want the reporter to know or to understand about your story? And and that's 3 or 4 topics at most. But those are the things you should make sure that you communicate, but know them in advance. Don't, go into the interview and say, oh, I'll just wing it. Really think about what the key messages are so that you're prepared to deliver them appropriately.
Right. And if you have somebody that hasn't gone through some sort of media training in your organization, who's going to be speaking to that reporter or that journalist, have somebody who is trained in media relations to be there to help facilitate the interview. Just so that you make sure that you're not, there's no stumbling over any roadblocks in that situation.
I don't see any additional questions, but we're at about time. I think we might have time for one more. So if anybody has one, and if not, I'll let Deanna wrap up. I'm glad to hear that she affirmed everything that I tell my clients, and everything that I know about reporters. She's an excellent reporter, so you're getting some really good advice here today, and I think you probably learned a lot. So I'll let her wrap up, and thank you for participating today.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming in, and thank you, Joanne, for moderating and facilitating this, and to the food pantries for having us both here. It's such a great organization, a cause that is dear to many of us. So if you ever have any questions, you can feel free. My email address again is just fox, F-O-X, onfood@gmail.com, and you can reach out. Sometimes I get backlogged, and I'll try to answer them as soon as I can. But I'm always really appreciative of receiving. A journalist is always very appreciative of receiving a story idea. It's very hard to just sit in our brains and to try to come up with story ideas every single day for the rest of eternity. So if you ever have a story idea, please, please, please reach out to me or to whoever might be applicable in your market. And thank you so much. I really appreciate this.